Good evening, students. This is Dr. Pinaki Wani, faculty on the platform of Nextillo. The wonder has a name. I'm the faculty of Physiology, and we are starting with this series of lectures in physiology. Before I begin with, let me take this opportunity to extend special thanks to Dr. Sunil sir for providing this particular platform to us, for sharing our knowledge with the young minds. I would also request you to subscribe to the Nextillo channel. You can download the app and use Helping Hand coupon to avail the app for 3 months in rupees 89 only. You may ask questions in between the sessions to make it more interesting. Thank you. After this, let me just give you a brief introduction of how we are going to go about. So basically, today's topic is action potential in a nerve fiber. This particular topic is a base of majority of the topics that we will be covering in physiology. Once you understand how action potential is generated, the basics of nervous system, cardiovascular system, gastrointestinal tract, skeletal muscle, and a lot many systems becomes very clear. And hence I've chosen this particular topic as our first topic. So let me just share the screen with you all and we'll start with the topics. The topic for the day is action potential in a nerve fiber. Now, what is an action potential? If you have to understand it in a very basic term, action potential is a way of communication. It is a way in which an excitable tissue, be it a nerve fiber, be it a skeletal muscle, a cardiac muscle, a cell in the central nervous system, communicates with the adjacent cell. So basically what is happening in an action potential is a stimulus, which is adequate in nature, gets converted into an electrical impulse, and that electrical impulse passes across the nerve and is transmitted to the next excitable tissue. As you can see in this particular diagram, the information is received by the dendrites. It is processed on the cell soma of the nerve fiber, and along the axon, there are a series of changes which happens, which is in the form of action potential, and that gets diverted and submitted to the next excitable tissue in the process. Now, before I begin with the actual process of action potential, let me just give you some of the brief ideas about the action potential. Now, before I begin, let's understand something called as resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential. Now, if I consider this as a cell membrane, this is the extracellular fluid and this is the intracellular fluid. Now, you all must be aware that in the extracellular fluid, the maximum concentration of the sodium ions is much more, whereas in the intracellular compartment or intracellular fluid, the concentration of potassium ions is higher. Now, what happens is when the cell is at rest, this equilibrium of sodium outside and potassium inside and the presence of multiple leaky channels, it allows the membrane to develop a potential at rest. This particular resting membrane potential is also called as polarized state of the cell. Polarized state of the cell. I'm really sorry with that scribbling, but this particular RMP is called as a polarized state of the cell. Now, what do you mean by polarized cell? Now, suppose if I consider only this much part of the cell and I draw the cell membrane, that means the inside of the cell is negative. This is the extracellular fluid, which is rich in sodium. This is the intracellular fluid, which is rich in potassium. And this is the inside of the cell. Now, this resting membrane potential is different in different excitable tissues. Now, since we are discussing a large myelinated nerve fiber, I'll give you resting membrane potential of a large myelinated nerve fiber, which is roughly around minus 70 millivolts. Now, when I'm saying minus 70 millivolts, that means when the membrane is at this particular level of minus 70, it is at rest. If you want this nerve to be exciting and excitable and to communicate the information to the next excitable tissue, it has to undergo series of changes because of the stimuli. Now, the next thing that I would like to tell you is coming about the stimuli. Now, if I have to write down stimuli, the stimuli can be adequate or it could be less than adequate. Now, for any excitable tissue, you have range of stimuli. It could be adequate or less than adequate. Now, when we are giving an adequate stimuli to an excitable tissue, here we have taken an example of a large myelinated nerve fiber with the resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolts, it will result into what is called as an action potential. On the other hand, if we give a less than adequate stimulus, that means below the threshold, then also it will produce some kind of a change in the membrane potential, which we call as a graded potential. Now, since the topic is about the action potential, we'll focus only on the action potential. So let's understand what is action potential. Now, before we go into the details, let me just tell you what are the objectives of this particular 1 hour session that we are taking. So we'll understand what is an action potential. We'll understand how the action potential is generated and what are the ionic bases of the various phases of the action potential. What is refractory period? What are the various toxins which are acting on various channels? And what are the effects of various ions on the action potential? So these are the subheadings on which we will be discussing the action potential in a large myelinated nerve fiber. Now, before we go into the details, let me give the definition of the action potential. Now, action potential is defined as sudden, abrupt change in the membrane potential when an adequate stimulus reaches the excitable tissue. So I've already shown you that the resting membrane potential is the state of the membrane where it is at rest, it is polarized. If you want it to become excitable and communicate the information, it has to be stimulated. The stimulation could be either adequate or inadequate. When it is an adequate stimulus, it results into a change in the membrane potential, which is action potential. There are various phases of action potential, which we are going to understand in a few minutes, but there are some characteristic features of an action potential that you have to understand so as to understand how it works. So the action potential is self-propagatory, non-decremental, and it has an all-or-none phenomenon. There's a particular instrument which is called as a cathode ray oscilloscope, which I've written over here, which is utilized to record the action potentials in myelinated nerve fiber. Now, self-propagatory, non-decremental, and all-or-none phenomenon, I'll tell you as we go on explaining into the details. Now, first, I'll show you how the recording looks like. So this is a diagram of the cathode ray oscilloscope, which is inserted in the axon of a large myelinated nerve fiber. And here it is recording the action potential. Now, this is not the actual action potential, it is a diagrammatic scientific representation which has multiple subgroups. Now, I'll just give you an elaborate of that and then we will go into the ionic basis. Okay. So now I have already told you the resting membrane potential of a large myelinated nerve fiber is roughly minus 70 millivolts. When a stimulus is applied, suppose if here we are applying a stimulus, this stimulus will result into the change in the membrane potential. So the membrane potential from minus 70 reaches somewhere around minus 55 millivolts, which is also called as a threshold potential. Once the membrane reaches something called as a threshold potential, there's a sudden upshoot of the membrane potential where it becomes less negative, or in other terms, it becomes more and more positive. That means from minus 70 to minus 55 to 0. And at one stage, it overshoots the 0 and touches plus 35 millivolts. And this point where it touches plus 35, it is called as a spike potential. And this entire upstroke that you have witnessed is called as depolarization, which is the initial phase of an action potential. Once it reaches plus 35, there are changes in the events which results into coming back to the normal or the downward movement of the upstroke, which is called as repolarization. So this entire downward movement of the polarization in order to reach the resting membrane potential is called as repolarization. And thereafter, you have three different phases. We have after depolarization, hyperpolarization, and after hyperpolarization. And finally, this after hyperpolarization again touches the resting membrane potential. So these are various changes in the events which occur as the adequate stimulus is applied to the nerve terminal or the axon terminal. I'll just give you a flow chart of all these things so that it becomes easier for you to understand. So what we have understood is what is an action potential, the definition, the characteristic feature, how it is recorded. I have given you a diagrammatic representation of how it appears. Now in a flow chart, I'll tell you those details and we will understand the ionic basis of the action potential. So let me just write down. So we are discussing the nerve fiber, large myelinated nerve fiber. Resting membrane potential, minus 70 millivolts. If an adequate stimulus is applied, it will cause threshold potential to be reached, which is approximately minus 55 millivolts. From here, we have the phase of depolarization, overshoot, spike potential. So this is 0 millivolts, this is plus 35 millivolts. Once this phase is reached, then the excitable tissue starts coming back to its normal polarized state. So from spike potential, different set of events begin and it results into what is called as depolarization, where the membrane starts becoming negative, and then we have something called as after depolarization, where it is touching minus 70 millivolts. Then we have hyperpolarization, where it becomes more negative. The membrane becomes more negative. It is minus 90 millivolts. So from minus 70, it becomes more negative. And from hyperpolarization, it goes into a phase of after hyperpolarization, where it again comes back to the resting membrane potential. So this is the entire cycle and the phasic changes which happen in the action potential. So if you have noted, the membrane goes from polarized state to depolarized state to repolarized state to hyperpolarization and back to the polarized state. This event is necessary to convert excitable tissue from a resting state to a state where it can communicate the impulse to the next excitable tissue, and hence this change occurs. This change is called as an action potential, which is sudden, abrupt change in the membrane potential because of an adequate stimulus, which goes through various phases, and it is self-propagatory, non-decremental, and it follows all or none phenomenon. So with this particular background, now what we will understand is the various phases. So diagram मैंने आपको पहले ही बता दिया. Now I'll draw another diagram and we'll discuss various phases. So there is slight scribbling of the pen, but I'll try to see that it doesn't happen. So this is minus 70 millivolts resting membrane potential. There's an adequate stimulus which is applied. If you remember, I have just now told you that inside the cell, potassium is high, outside the cell, sodium is high. Now what happens is when the adequate stimulus is applied, the cell contains a large number of voltage gated sodium and potassium channels. Now when I'm using the terminology voltage gated channels, that means these channels are sensitive to the change in the membrane potential. Now here what I've done is adequate stimulus is applied. So it's a kind of an electrical change which is applied to a membrane. This electrical change is sensed by the voltage gated channels. Two important channels, sodium voltage gated channels and potassium voltage gated channels, which are present on the cell membrane. Now, every time adequate stimulus is applied, this voltage gated channels respond and they open up. The first event that we are going to understand is for the sodium voltage gated channels. So what happens is, suppose if this is the cell and this is the voltage gated channel. Okay. Sodium channel. Now, every time an adequate stimulus is applied, this voltage gated sodium channels open, and because sodium is more on the outside and because the inside of the membrane is negative, sodium will try to move from extracellular fluid to the intracellular compartment, because of the two things. One is the electrical gradient. Inside of the membrane is negative compared to the outside, and concentration gradient where sodium concentration is more on the outside as compared to the inside. So because of these two gradients, it will drive sodium to move outside, from outside to inside. Because sodium is a positively charged ion, it will bring in positivity. Now, because it is bringing in positivity, what will happen is from minus 70 millivolts, because a lot of positively charged ions are moving inside, the membrane starts becoming more and more positive. So more and more positively charged ions move inside. From minus 70, the membrane reaches to what is called as threshold potential of minus 55 millivolts. Now at minus 55 millivolts, there's one more event that happens. There's something called as Hodgkin's positive feedback cycle. There's something called as Hodgkin's positive feedback cycle. Now what happens is at minus 55, all the sodium channels begin to open abruptly. Initially, what was happening from minus 70 to minus 55? Only few sodium channels were opening. Whereas once it reached minus 55 millivolts, which is the threshold potential for a large myelinated nerve fiber, all the sodium channels open up. Now, what will happen when all the sodium channels open up? A lot of sodium influx happens. And because of that, there is a sudden upshoot of the action potential. So this is the sudden upshoot which has happened. So from minus 55, it goes beyond zero and it touches approximately plus 35 millivolts. So this entire upstroke that I've shown you is a process of depolarization, which is because of the sodium influx, because of the activation of the sodium channels, which are voltage sensitive. Okay, so it reaches plus 35. So we have understood what is the process of depolarization. Now, if you see after the depolarization, when it has reached plus 35, another set of events begin to bring the membrane potential back to the polarized state. So now we are going to understand what are the events which are happening in this particular part. This is repolarization. Now, if you remember, I've told you there are voltage gated sodium channels and there are voltage gated potassium channels. Now, what is the speciality of these channels? One, they are voltage sensitive. Secondly, the voltage gated sodium channels are very fast to open and they are fast to close. That means initially when you are applying a stimulus, these sodium channels will suddenly open. There will be a lot of influx of sodium. The membrane will suddenly shoot to 0 and plus 35 and they are fast to close. So at plus 35, all the sodium channels which have opened to cause depolarization will suddenly shut down. On the other hand, the voltage gated potassium channels, which have also sensitive to the voltage change, but they are slow to open. So by the time the entire depolarization takes place, so potassium channels are yet to open. They are very slow in their activity. Somewhere at around plus 35, they open to their fullest. Now, what does potassium channel do? Now, I have already told you potassium is more inside and less outside. So when the potassium channels open, potassium will try to move outside because of the concentration gradient. So what is happening? Positively charged potassium ions are being moved out from these voltage gated potassium channels which are slow to open. Now, because they are carrying the positively charged ions outside, positivity is moving outside, and the membrane which was so positive starts to come back to its polarized state. So from plus 35, slowly the positively charged ions are moving outside the cell, and the positivity of the cell goes on reducing, and it comes to back to its resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolts. Now here, if you remember, so this phase is what we were discussing, that is a repolarization phase because of the efflux of potassium, which is caused because of the concentration gradient where potassium is more on the inside as compared to the outside, and that results into drastic movement of potassium from inside to the outside, resulting into movement of positively charged ions to the outside and making the membrane repolarized. Now, once the membrane is repolarizing, it reaches back to its minus 70 millivolts. And if you see the diagram carefully, the downstroke is not steep once it reaches minus 70 millivolts. The downstroke is a little slacky, it is a little curved. This curviness is called as after depolarization. Why after depolarization? Because it is roughly, sorry, this is minus 55 millivolts. So around minus 55, this particular curve is after depolarization. Now, what is the reason for this not so sharp downward movement? See, if you have understood this point, the potassium is moving out of the cell, resulting into efflux and resulting into repolarization. Now, the potassium starts accumulating outside the cell. So the gradient with which potassium was moving outside the cell is reduced. Although potassium channels are open, but the movement of potassium has reduced. So because of that, this downward movement from minus 55 to minus 70 is becoming a little slower, and it is becoming a little sluggish. It is not as sharp as compared to the previous state. So this phase is called as after depolarization. So this is repolarization, this is after depolarization. Now, the next step that you have to understand is from after depolarization, the membrane goes into a state of hyperpolarization. What do you mean by hyperpolarization? Now, if you see the diagram carefully, the membrane potential, once it touches minus 70, does not stop its process. It goes beyond minus 70. So it touches somewhere around minus 80 and minus 90 millivolts. The membrane becomes more and more negative. Now, what is the reason for the membrane to become more and more negative? Now, see what is happening. I've already told you potassium channels are slow to close. Now, if the potassium channels are slow to close, what will happen? Even though the gradient for the movement is reduced for the potassium is still leaving the cell because gates are open. If the gates are open, potassium is being moved out. Positively charged ions are moved out of the cell, and because of that, the cell is losing its positivity and becoming more and more negative, which is what is happening. From minus 70, it is becoming minus 80, minus 90 because of the movement of potassium outside the cell, because of the slow closure of the potassium channels. This is a characteristic feature of the sodium and the potassium voltage gated channels. This is very classical. So this is for the hyperpolarization. Now, one thing you will understand is every time the nerve or the excitable tissue is depolarized, it can be easily activated. And every time the membrane is hyperpolarized, it is in the inhibited state. That means it becomes difficult for a membrane to come back to its normalcy. That means from minus 90, now the nerve will have to reach minus 70. And then when an adequate stimulus comes, it has to reach to the threshold potential, initiate a depolarization, and it will result into a stimulated state of a excitable tissue. Now, from the hyperpolarized state, now the nerve will again try to come back to the polarized state, which is called as after hyperpolarization. How does this happen? Now, if you all are aware, there's something called as sodium potassium ATPase pump. This pump is located in all the cells of the body. What is the function of this particular pump? It throws 3 sodium out and it takes 2 potassium inside the cell. Now, what is happening in this entire process of action potential? It has disrupted the normalcy. What was normal? Inside the cell, potassium was more. Outside the cell, sodium was more. This was normal. Because of the action potential, what has happened? Inside the cell, sodium has increased. Outside the cell, potassium has increased. Because of the stimulus, which has caused change in the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels, which has resulted into this disruption. Now, sodium potassium ATPase pumps work is to bring back the normalcy or bring back the homeostasis. So what it will do, all the sodium that has accumulated inside the excitable tissue, it will be pumped out of the cell in order to regain the homeostasis or regain the normalcy, and all the potassium that was thrown out of the cell will be brought back inside the cell with the help of the sodium potassium ATPase pump. Now here I'll add one more important point. The sodium potassium ATPase pump is a pump which is having, it is a heterometric pump. That means it is having a alpha, beta and a gamma subunits. And there is an intracellular and the extracellular attachment for the sodium and the potassium and the ATPase and the phosphorylation site. And it also utilizes magnesium for its activity. Now, if you see, it throws 3 sodium ions outside versus it takes 2 potassium ions inside. So there's a deficit of 1 positively charged ion. So this particular sodium potassium pump is electrogenic. That means it helps in contributing negativity inside the cell. Hence, it is called as electrogenic pump. Now, because it is contributing to the negativity inside the cell, by pumping 3 sodium versus 2 potassium outside and inside respectively, it tries to bring back the membrane potential to normal, that is minus 70 millivolts, which is a resting membrane potential of an excitable tissue. So all these are the events of the normal action potential in a nerve fiber. I am discussing a large myelinated nerve fiber with a resting membrane potential of minus 70. When an adequate stimulus is applied, voltage-gated fast sodium channels open up, which causes sodium influx. Positively charged sodium ions are moving inside. Hence, from minus 70, the membrane will become less negative. It reaches to a threshold potential of minus 55 millivolts. Once it reaches minus 55 millivolts, it results into a positive feedback cycle, which is also called as Hodgkin's sodium channel positive feedback cycle, which results into opening of almost 5,000 to 50,000 sodium channels. Now imagine so many voltage-gated sodium channels are opening up. So it results into huge influx of sodium inside. A lot of positively charged ions will move inside the cell and result in a sudden upstroke of the depolarization wave of an action potential, which results into overshoot beyond 0 and a spike potential reaching to plus 35 millivolts. At plus 35, another event starts beginning where the voltage-gated potassium channels, which are slow to open, become active. Because of the concentration gradient, sodium has undergone certain changes. Potassium, which is high in the intracellular fluid, will try to move outside the cell, moving the positivity from outside to from inside to outside, resulting into repolarization phase. And this repolarization phase will try to bring the membrane potential back to its polarized state, that is minus 70 millivolts. This repolarization phase is characterized by outflux or efflux of potassium ions, and the potassium ions are moving out via the voltage-gated potassium channels, which are slow to open and slow to close. Because they are slow to open and slow to close, there is a lot of potassium that keeps on accumulating and keeps on moving outside the cell, which results into, after depolarization, hyperpolarization, where the membrane becomes more negative than the resting membrane potential. And then it goes into the phase of after hyperpolarization, where due to the presence of sodium potassium ATPase pump, the membrane is brought back to the polarized state of the resting membrane potential. These are the various events of the action potential in a large myelinated nerve fiber. So again, I'll show you the diagram. This is the ideal action potential of a nerve fiber. And if you see here also, they have shown the resting membrane potential as -70. From -70, it reaches a threshold potential of -55. Here it is sodium influx. This entire phase is depolarization phase, where it reaches 0 and +35 spike potential. Till here, all this is characterized by the sodium influx, by the voltage gated sodium channels and the Hodgkin's positive feedback cycle. Once it reaches +35, the voltage gated potassium channels come into action. There's a potassium efflux, and the entire downward movement is called as repolarization. The lower part of the repolarization is not sharp, it is sluggish. From -55 to -70, it is called as after depolarization, because the gradient for the movement of the potassium is reduced. Then, since the potassium channels are slow to close, the membrane will become more and more negative, which is called as hyperpolarization. And eventually the sodium potassium pump takes over and the membrane becomes back to the resting membrane potential, and this phase is called as after hyperpolarization. So these are various events which are happening at the level of action potential. Now, these are the channels, the voltage gated channels, which causes movement of the ions across the cell membrane. So this is a cell membrane. And if you see, these are the sodium channels. Now, I'll also show you the potassium channel and the sodium channel, but here again, I'll show you in a diagram. So I'll try to see that there is no scribbling, but so this is -70, upstroke, downstroke. I've just phased it out now. So I've just separated a little bit. Now what I want you to understand is these voltage gated sodium channels and potassium channels, you have to understand a little bit more about them in order to understand the next terminology, which is called as a refractory period. Now, what is refractory period? Now, refractory period is that period following the adequate stimulus where an excitable tissue will show no response at all. The refractory period is divided into two phases. One is called as absolute refractory period and the other one is called as relative refractory period. In absolute refractory period, any kind of a stimulus will not show a response in an excitable tissue. Whereas in a relative refractory period, if the strength of the stimulus is higher, then the excitable tissue will show a response. Now, just to clarify one more thing, refractory period is after the adequate stimulus is already working on the excitable tissue, and while it is working, you are trying to give a second stimulus. If that second stimulus falls in the absolute refractory period, it will not show a response. And if that second stimulus falls in the relative refractory period, it will show a response. That is a refractory period. Now, what is the physiological basis for having a refractory period? Why should an excitable tissue be completely irresponsible or non-responsive to a stimulus when it is an absolute refractory period? And why should it respond when it is falling in the relative refractory period is the most important concept. Now, what is the concept behind that? So suppose if this is my action potential, almost 2/3 from the beginning till this part is your absolute refractory period. And from here to here, this entire part is your relative refractory period. So if you consider the entire duration, till this point is your absolute refractory period, and this entire phase is your relative refractory period. Now, What you need to understand is why an excitable tissue becomes non-responsive in this phase and becomes responsive in this phase. So for that, you need to understand the voltage-gated sodium channels. Now, to begin with, I'll just show you the diagram of these sodium channels. Now, suppose if it is at rest at minus 70 millivolts, how does the voltage-gated sodium channel look like? Now, suppose if this is my cell membrane, and this is my channel. Extracellular part, intracellular part. Intracellular part of the sodium channels has inactivation gate on the inside and the activation gate on the outside. So this is how a sodium channel looks like. Now, if you see when the membrane is at rest, this is how the sodium channel looks like. The inactivation gate, which is also called as H gate, is open, whereas activation gate, which is also called as M gate, is closed. Now, because of this particular configuration of sodium channels, what will happen? Sodium cannot move inside because the M gate is closed or the activation gate is closed. This is at rest. Now, if you are giving an adequate stimulus, what change happens in this particular channel? So I'll draw the same diagram and the same channel. Now, what is happening when you're giving an adequate stimulus? What happens is the inactivation gate was already open. Now the activation gate also open. So the M gate is also open and the H gate is also open. So now what happens? From the ECF, sodium can move inside the cell. And because the sodium is moving inside the cell, it can cause this upward movement of the action potential, that is the depolarization phase. So this is at rest. This is during the depolarization phase. Now, I have told you from this part to this part, entire thing is an absolute refractory period. So now let's understand what is happening during the repolarization phase, during this phase. Now, if you see what has happening is, in this part, the repolarization part, what is the configuration? I've told you the M gate and H gates were open. Now M gate is still open, but the H gate closes. H gate has closed and the M gate is still open. Now what is happening? Even though the M gate is open, the H gate is closed and hence the sodium cannot move inside from the extracellular to the intracellular fluid. Hence, even if you are giving whatever amount of stimulus, whatever strength of the stimulus, because the H gates are closed, sodium cannot move inside. And because the sodium is not moving inside, if you are giving any stimulus during this particular phase, especially the repolarization phase, it will not show a response. It will not show a response because sodium is not moving inside. Now, what happens during the relative refractory period? During the relative refractory period, just see what is the configuration of the sodium channel. Now, what is happening is, now slowly the sodium channel is trying to come back to the normal position. So what was happening? The M gate was open. It is trying to come back to normal. And the H gate, which was closed, is trying to open. So for a moment of the second, both the gates are slightly open. At this particular stage, that is during this part, this to this part, if you are giving a more than adequate stimulus, that more than adequate stimulus is good enough to cause the sodium to push through these slightly open gates and the sodium will move inside. And the moment the sodium moves inside, it will initiate the membrane to touch the threshold potential and strike a next action potential. And hence, the excitable tissue becomes responsive to the adequate stimulus in the relative refractory period, but it is completely non-responsive in the absolute refractory period. So I hope this concept is clear with respect to the sodium channel activation and inactivation gate. Now you will ask me, what about potassium channels? So potassium channels are not so complicated. Potassium channels have only one activation gate and they are given terminology N gates, N. Whereas for sodium, it was M activation gate and H inactivation gate. So this is the basis of refractory period and this is applicable in all the excitable tissue. One important point that I would like to mention over here is the refractory period is very much significant, especially in the cardiac tissue, which has a long refractory period. Because it has a long refractory period of almost 200 to 250 milliseconds, the muscle, the cardiac tissue is what I'm talking about, is not responding to every stimulus that it is getting, which is beneficial for the heart, because if it starts responding to every stimuli, it will undergo fatigue. We don't want the heart to undergo fatigue. And hence, that absolute refractory phase gives heart muscle adequate time to fill, to rest, and to become responsive to the next appropriate stimuli. So the refractory period becomes a very important physiological aspect, especially for the excitable tissue like nerve, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle. So that is about the action potential. We have understood the various ionic bases of the action potential, and we have also understood the various refractory phases. So this is the activation and inactivation gate for the sodium. I have given you slightly different configuration. Here they have shown a slightly different configuration. Here they have shown activation and inactivation both on one side. So if you see, when the membrane is at rest, the activation gates are closed, or the M gates are closed, and the inactivation gates are open. When the adequate stimulus is applied, both the gates are open, H and M. Whereas when there is a phase of repolarization, M gate is open, but the H gate is closed. So these are various changes in the voltage gated sodium channel, which influences the responsiveness of an excitable tissue, which is also called as refractory period. Understand that refractory period is not the part of the latent period. It is a part of the response of the first stimulus, during which the membrane is either showing a response or it is not showing a response at all. So now this is for the potassium channel. I have told you potassium channel has only one gate, voltage gated potassium channel. They are very slow to open and they are very slow to close. These gates are also called as N gates. So at -70, they remain closed and they are trying to open now. They are very slow to open. Once it reaches +35, they are completely open, and it comes back to normal at -80 or -70 millivolts. This is the positive feedback Hodgkin cycle, which I was talking about. That means when the membrane is at rest, -70, say it reaches a threshold potential of -55. At -55, it results into opening of large number of sodium channels. So few sodium channels will result into opening of large number of sodium channels, and that large number of sodium channels will result into sudden upshoot of the membrane potential, which is to 0 and +35 millivolts, which is called as a spike potential. This entire phase is called as a Hodgkin's positive feedback cycle for voltage gated sodium channels. So again, just a diagrammatic representation. Here what they are doing is they are correlating the change in the membrane potential with the activity of the sodium and the potassium voltage gated channel. So I want you to have a very close look. Here the membrane is at -70 millivolts, the resting membrane potential. And if you see the configuration of the channels, the activation gate is closed. The inactivation gate is open for the sodium. Sodium is more on the extracellular compartment, less on the intracellular compartment. Potassium is high in the intracellular compartment. This is at rest. Now you are applying the adequate stimulus. Now what is happening? The M gate and H gates both are open for the sodium channel. The potassium channels are yet to open. However, they are still sensitized to the adequate stimulus. Both the channels are opening. Both the gates are opening for the sodium channel, which results into sodium influx. Sodium movement inside will bring the membrane potential to a threshold potential of -50 to -55. This results into positive feedback cycle by Hodgkin's, and it results into upward movement, the action potential is beginning. Sodium moves inside the cell. A lot of sodium moves from outside to the inside. Explosive depolarization reaches 0. So this entire upstroke is depolarization. It reaches to the peak, and at the peak, another important event happens is the H gate closes. The M gate remains open, and the slow potassium channels which were responding to the action potential or which were responding to the adequate stimulus have now completely opened. The N gates have completely opened. Now, because the N gates are open, potassium being high in the intracellular compartment tries to move out. Because of the efflux of the potassium, the membrane potential tries to come back to its normal, and it touches the threshold of -55. It becomes more and more negative. It goes into a state of hyperpolarization because the potassium channels are yet open, resulting into continuous efflux of the potassium. And eventually, as the membrane undergoes its normalcy, the sodium-potassium pump brings back the normalcy by throwing 3 sodium out, taking 2 potassium inside. The membrane tries to come back to its normal, and it achieves the normal polarized state. So from polarized state to depolarization, spike potential, repolarization, after depolarization, hyperpolarization. After hyperpolarization, it comes back to the resting membrane potential. This entire phase from here to here is the absolute refractory period, and from here to here is the relative refractory period. Here the edge gates are closed, here the edge gates slightly open up, and hence resulting into absolute and relative refractory period. So these are the various events which we have tried to understand in the previous few slides. I'm keeping this particular slide for you to grasp it again. Go through the entire discussion once again. And we will go to the next topic, that is the various toxins which are working on these voltage gated sodium and potassium channels. Since I'm discussing toxins, that means these channels will be blocked. And if these channels are blocked, it will stop the propagation of action potential, or it will stop the initiation of action potential. And hence you need to know these. A lot of MCQs and a lot of clinical based questions do come on these particular topics. Action potential is a base of all the physiological events, and hence you need to know this very, very, very properly. This is the absolute and the relative refractory period, which we have already done. I've already told you, shown you the basis of the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. You have to remember that the voltage gated sodium channels have the activation and the inactivation gate. At rest, the activation gate or the M gates are closed and the inactivation gates are open. When the adequate stimulus is applied, the activation and the inactivation gates, that is M gate and H gates, are open, resulting into sodium influx. Once it reaches +35, the M gates remain open, that is the activation gates remain open, but the inactivation gate or the H gates are closed. Because the H gates are closed, sodium influx cannot happen. And that is the reason why the membrane is not responsive to any stimulus, which is absolute refractory period. After this period, H gate slowly starts to open up, there's a partial movement where M gate and H gates are partially open. In this fraction of second, if you give a second stimulus, it will show a next action potential which is falling in the relative refractory period. Once that entire repolarization phase is over, the activation and inactivation gates come back to their normal configuration. What was their normal configuration? The H gates are open and the M gates are closed. That is at the resting membrane potential state, and the membrane becomes polarized. That is the basis of the absolute and the relative refractory period. Now coming to the next point, this particular diagram is showing you a series of, or the number of toxins which are working on various channels. Here I'll concentrate mainly on the sodium and the potassium channels. There are various other poisons which are shown in this particular diagram, but for today's topic we'll concentrate on two important voltage gated channels, that is the sodium and the potassium voltage gated channels. Now sodium voltage gated channels, there are two identified toxins. One is called as tetrodotoxin and the other one is saxitoxin. These two toxins are potential blockers of voltage gated sodium channels. That means if these toxins are utilized, it will cause blockage of the sodium channels, and as sodium channels block, it will prevent the generation of an action potential, and if action potential generation is inhibited, it will cause inhibition of the nerve fiber or inhibition of an excitable tissue. The excitable tissue will fail to communicate. On the other hand, potassium channels or voltage gated potassium channels, the toxins identified are dendrotoxin. There's another toxin which is called as triethyl ammonium. Triethyl ammonium, how will you remember this? Triethyl ammonium blocks potassium channel. So teak, triethyl ammonium blocks potassium channels, and dendrotoxin, they are potentially blockers of potassium voltage gated channels. So these are few important ions that you need to understand when we are discussing the importance of toxins and their effect on the voltage gated channels. Now what we'll do is we'll quickly go through some of the MCQs and you can give your responses on the comment section, and we will discuss these MCQs quickly. Okay, so the question is, magnitude of an action potential is determined by which ion? The options given are sodium, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. So if you can put it on the comment section. Oh, very quick to respond. So the correct answer, magnitude of an action potential, that means the height of an action potential, is determined by the sodium ions. More the sodium ion, more will be the influx, more will be the amplitude or the magnitude of the action potential in a myelinated nerve fiber. Am I clear with the explanation? Magnesium, if you remember, I've told you, is an important ion which is regulating the activity of sodium potassium ATPase pump. So remember, sodium potassium ATPase pump is working fullest in the presence of magnesium ion. Potassium ion, if you remember, is responsible for the process of repolarization. That means for the downfall of an action potential. कैल्शियम की भी एक एक्टिविटी है जो हम लोग अभी डिस्कस करेंगे, अभी डिस्कस कर लेते हैं इसी डायग्राम में, इसी क्वेश्चन में. नाउ इफ यू रिमेंबर, मैंने आपको सोडियम के चैनल्स के बारे में बताया था, वोल्टेज गेटेड सोडियम चैनल्स के गेट्स के बारे में बताया था. इफ यू रिमेंबर, आई हैव शोन यू देयर इज समथिंग कॉल्ड एज M gate and H gate. So M gate and H gate for the voltage gated sodium channel. ये हो गया ECF और ये हो गया ICF. Now calcium, if you see, calcium is a guard for the gates. Calcium is acting as a guard on the gate. मतलब जैसे security guard होते हैं ना जो gates को बंद रखते हैं, वैसे कैल्शियम की एक्टिविटी है. So whenever the calcium is present, it will try to keep the guard or the gates closed. So more the calcium, gates will remain more closed. If the gates are remaining more closed, sodium का influx नहीं होगा because gates बंद रह रहे हैं. अगर सोडियम का इन्फ्लक्स नहीं हो रहा है तो जो एक्साइटेबल टिश्यू है उसकी एक्साइटेबिलिटी ज्यादा होगी कि कम होगी? My question is, if the calcium levels are increased, how will it affect the excitability of the excitable tissue? Calcium is acting as a gatekeeper for the M gate and H gate. So increase in the calcium levels, how will it affect the excitability? Any responses? Okay, I'll repeat again. Calcium is acting as a gatekeeper. More the calcium, the gates will remain closed. If the gates are remaining closed, will it cause the movement of the ions easily? No. If the gates are remaining closed, ions cannot move inside. And if the ions cannot move across, the excitability reduces. Excitability reduces. So if the calcium is increased, that means in hypercalcemia, the excitability of the nerve fiber is reduced. Why reduced? Because ज़्यादा calcium आ गया, gates बंद रहेंगे, movement of ions नहीं होंगे. On the other hand, if there is hypocalcemia, less calcium, the gates will remain open. If the gates are remaining open, ions can easily move inside, resulting into hyperexcitable state, hyperexcitability. That means there is an inverse relationship between the calcium and the excitability of the nerve fiber. Please remember this point. Very, very important point clinically also. When we are discussing the calcium metabolism, you will realize this importance, but उसका base जो है वो ये है. Calcium ज़्यादा रहा तो excitability कम हो जाएगी because more calcium, more gates closed, more the gate closed, less will be the movement of ions. On the other hand, less calcium, the gates will remain open, more open gates, more movement of ions, resulting into more activity of the excitable tissue. Am I clear with my explanation? I'm really sorry with the scribbling. There's some problem with the writing pad, but am I clear with this particular explanation of calcium? Or do you want me to explain it? Sodium has only effect on the magnitude or the height of the action potential. और उसका कोई इंपॉर्टेंस नहीं है. सोडियम की वजह से एक्शन पोटेंशियल जनरेट होगा, इसके अलावा उसका और कोई रोल नहीं है. कैल्शियम विल डिटरमाइन द एक्साइटेबिलिटी ऑफ अ नर्व फाइबर. Magnesium determines the action of the ATPase pump, and potassium is responsible for the repolarization phase. I hope I have made the importance of the ions clear to you. We'll go to the next question. If there is any doubt, you can put it on the comment section. I'm very happy to solve your doubts. No issues. The second question is, the true statement regarding the action potential is, the options are, the depolarization is a result of outward movement of the potassium ion. The action potential occurs due to sudden opening of sodium channels. Option C, the action potential occurs when the potential reaches a threshold of minus 65 millivolts. And option D, the resting membrane potential is minus 90 millivolts. So, yes, the students are answering, and most of you are answering correct. And the correct answer is option B. The action potential is occurring due to sudden opening of sodium channels. And if you have heard the entire lecture, You must have realized that these sodium channels are voltage gated sodium channels, which are fast to open and fast to close. They respond to the sudden change or the sudden application of an adequate stimulus. And it has two gates, the M gate and the H gate, which is also called as activation gate and inactivation gate, which results into influx of sodium because of concentration gradient and electrical gradient. Now, what about other options? The depolarization is a result of outward movement of potassium ions? No, it is a repolarization, which is a result of the efflux of the potassium ions. So first option is incorrect. Option C, action potential occurs when the potential reaches a threshold of minus 65 millivolts. Now here, if you see, the question clearly mentions about the nerve. Nerve की जो resting membrane potential है, it is minus 70 when we are discussing a large myelinated nerve fiber, and when we are discussing a large myelinated nerve fiber, the resting membrane potential is minus 70 millivolts, and the threshold potential that it has to reach in order to generate the action potential is minus 55 millivolt. For every excitable tissue, these figures are fixed. For the nerve fiber, the RMP is minus 70 and the threshold is plus 15 millivolts. That means from 70, it has to jump by plus 15 millivolts to reach minus 55 millivolts. So here, the option should be minus 55 millivolts. And here the option is minus 70 millivolts. So obviously the correct answer becomes option B. Now, the next question. Sodium channels are specifically blocked by, and the options are nifedipine, tetrodotoxin, triethyl lead, and choline. Answers? So this particular question is dealing about the toxins which are blocking the voltage gated sodium channel. I've shown you two voltage gated sodium channels and their specific blockers. So yes, the correct answer is tetrodotoxin. Another toxin that blocks the sodium channel specifically, if you remember the name, it is not nifedipine. It is tetrodotoxin. Another toxin which I have mentioned in my slide, if you remember, if anyone can put that name. It is saxitoxin. So tetrodotoxin and saxitoxin, which specifically blocks sodium channels. For potassium, if you remember, I have told you there is triethyl ammonium. It is not tetraethyl lead, it is triethyl ammonium. Now come to the next question. Which of the following is true about the refractory period in the nerve fiber? I have tried to explain you what is, yes, very good, Pratik. I've tried to explain you what is refractory period. I hope that concept is clear. We'll try to understand this particular concept again with the help of the MCQ. So let's see what are the options. Option A, the refractory period is caused by the hyperpolarization phase of an action potential. Option B, absolute refractory period refers to that point during which stronger stimulus will lead to the generation of a new action potential. Option C, the relative refractory period refers to that time during which stronger stimulus will lead to generation of a new action potential, and the duration is roughly 300 to 400 milliseconds. Any guesses? Any correct answers? If you remember, I've told you refractory period is following the adequate stimulus. That means in a nerve fiber, you have already given a stimulus and the nerve is already responding to that stimulus. While it is responding to the stimulus, you are trying to give a second stimuli. If it falls in the absolute refractory period, it will not show a response. If that second stimulus falls in the relative refractory period, it will show a response. For a nerve fiber, the entire duration of an action potential, if you have seen the graph, is merely 5 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds. for a nerve fiber that I'm discussing. For a cardiac tissue, the refractory period is far more. Here we are discussing for a nerve fiber. So please pick your answer carefully. So few of the students have given the correct answer. The correct answer over here is option C, which is the relative refractory period, which refers to the time duration during which the stronger stimulation, now I'm discussing about the second stimulus, which is stronger, will lead to a generation of a new action potential. Here, the second stimulus is falling in the relative refractory period, during which the membrane will show a response. If it was falling in the absolute refractory period, it would have not shown a response. So the option B is incorrect. Option A says that refractory period is a part of hyperpolarization. No. In fact, hyperpolarization के पहले ही refractory period का पूरा phase खत्म हो जाता है. After hyperpolarization, and hyperpolarization is when the membrane becomes more and more negative. वहाँ पे, in fact, the membrane becomes completely inhibited. It will not show any response in hyperpolarized state. And the last option is duration is 300 to 400 milliseconds. In a nerve fiber, it is very less. It is roughly around 5 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds. 300 to 400 is a range for the cardiac tissue. So the correct option over here is option C. We'll go to one more MCQ, which is image based, and then we will discuss the question of the day. So since a lot of image based questions are asked, I have put up this particular point. Now let's see this. ये हमारा एक्शन पोटेंशियल का पूरा डायग्राम है जिसमें फेज 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 लिखे हुए हैं और इसके हिसाब से क्वेश्चंस पूछे हैं. So see the first question. At which labeled point on an action potential is the potassium closest to the electrochemical equilibrium? Now, before you go into solving this particular question, there's something called as electrochemical equilibrium, which is determined by something called as Nernst potential. Nernst potential says that there's an equilibrium set during which the movement of the ion across the cell membrane is determined. ठीक है, एक potential है which is called as Nernst potential, which determines the inward and outward movement of an ion. For potassium, that point where the inward and the outward movement of potassium is same is approximately minus 90 millivolts. Minus 90 for potassium. So Nernst potential is a potential where which determines the movement of the ion outside and inside. एक particular point पे जो ion की movement है across the cell is equal. That point is called as Nernst equilibrium. For potassium, that point is minus 90 millivolts. अब question क्या है? At which labeled point of an action potential is potassium closest to its equilibrium potential? That means ये डायग्राम में minus 90 के आसपास कौन सा पॉइंट आ रहा है? इसके लिए आपको क्या जानना जरूरी है कि पोटेशियम का इलेक्ट्रोकेमिकल इक्विलिब्रियम पॉइंट क्या होता है, which I have told you is minus 90 millivolts as per the Nernst equilibrium. So at minus 90 millivolts, which point is closest? Students are answering C. Minus 90 millivolt. Minus 90 यहाँ पे आता है. Minus 90 is a hyperpolarized state. Hyperpolarized state is shown as point number 5 in this diagram. So potassium ka equilibrium as per Nernst equilibrium is minus 90. And in this diagram, the action potential which is closest, or the point of action potential which is closest, is point number 5. So the correct option is point D. I hope you all are understanding the question, the image and the question. You may not be aware of the Nernst potential. I think we will discuss the Nernst potential in the next class. Nernst potentials are the potentials which determine the resting membrane potential. For every ion, it is very specific. पोटेशियम के लिए इट इज -90 मिलीवोल्ट, तो यहाँ पे -90 मिलीवोल्ट नंबर 5 पे है, दैट्स व्हाई द करेक्ट आंसर इज डी. नाउ सी द नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन. Point at which driving force of sodium is maximum. Options are 0.1, 0.3, 0.4 and 0.5. सोडियम का ड्राइविंग फोर्स इज मैक्सिमम, दैट मींस सोडियम का इनफ्लक्स मैक्सिमम कौन से पॉइंट पे हो रहा है? If you remember, I've told you sodium influx is determined by two things, electrochemical gradient and the concentration gradient. Both these gradients will cause sodium to move from extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid via voltage gated sodium channels. अब ये मूवमेंट सबसे ज्यादा सोडियम की कहां पे हो रही है? Some students have answered B. See, I'll tell you. यहां से यहां तक सोडियम है, this entire phase. यहाँ पे सोडियम का चैनल ब्लॉक हो जाता है. इफ यू रिमेंबर, आई हैव टोल्ड यू एच गेट्स आर क्लोज, सो सोडियम की मूवमेंट नहीं हो रही है. दिस एंटायर पार्ट सोडियम का मूवमेंट नहीं होता है. सो द मैक्सिमम ड्राइविंग फोर्स इज एट पॉइंट ए, और द ऑप्शन ए इज द करेक्ट ऑप्शन. Are you all understanding the question? You get a lot of image based questions. That's why I put this particular diagram specifically for you. At point 1, the gradient for the movement of sodium determined by the electrical gradient and the concentration gradient is maximum. Point number 3, 4 and 5 पे sodium channels बंद हो जाते हैं. They are fast to open, they are fast to close. We are discussing sodium channel. Point 3, 4 and 5 पे potassium channel सबसे ज्यादा काम कर रहा है. So the correct answer is option A या point 1. Am I clear with this point? Now see the next question. What processes are responsible for the change in the membrane potential that occurs between point 3 and point 4? यहाँ से लेके यहाँ तक, what are the events? Now before that, before we go into the options, what is the name given to that event? This downfall, what is the name given to that event? Can you put it on the comment section? What is this downward movement? Name given to that downward movement of an action potential. Options padho. Don't just answer without reading the options. Downward movement, point 3 to point 4. Please read the options correctly. Point 3 to point 4. Wait, I'll just clear the slide. Now, can you see the slide clearly? The question is point 3 से point 4. यहाँ से लेके यहाँ तक. What are the events? यहाँ पे सोडियम है, इनफ्लक्स. यहाँ से लेके यहाँ तक it is called as repolarization. Yes, you are right. Repolarization is because of the movement of potassium out of the cell. So potassium moves out of the cell, which brings the membrane from plus 35 to minus 70 millivolts. Are you clear with the concept? Please do not make silly mistakes. So the correct answer is, please read the options correctly. Again, तुम लोग पढ़ नहीं रहे हो, बहुत जल्दबाजी में आंसर कर रहे हो. Option A is movement of sodium into the cell. Option B is movement of sodium out of the cell. Option C is movement of potassium in the cell. Option D is movement of potassium out of the cell. Please read the options correctly. Potassium efflux बोला है. So the correct option is option D. Please do not be in a hurry to answer. See, even if you know the concept, if you are not reading the options correctly, you are giving a wrong answer. Please see the answers and the options correctly. Chalo. That brings me to the next question. Maximum number of sodium channels per square micrometer is present in maximum number of sodium channels. So this is the question of the day. And the one who gives quick answer, the quickest answer will be the star of the day. So all the best. Maximum number of sodium. ये concept हम लोगों ने discuss नहीं किया है. This is your pre-reading or reading part. Correct option, correct answer. Huh? Maximum number of sodium channels per square meter. Now, we have understood what are voltage gated sodium channels. We have understood what is the movement of sodium. I have not given you in numbers the presence of sodium channels. कौन से part पे सबसे ज़्यादा होता है? वो ये question है. Maximum number of sodium channels. The question is not the generation of action potential. The question is maximum number of sodium channels. So please read the options, and if you know the number, then you will be getting the correct answer. So now I'll first give you the number of channels as per the options. Now, what does this mean? Number of sodium channels. Now, suppose if I draw the nerve fiber, ये है cell body, ये है axon, और ये है आपका axon terminal, और ये है आपका myelin sheath. ठीक है? A very strange looking nerve, but this is just for your understanding. ये है मेरे dendrites. अब the question is about the sodium channels, number of sodium channels. So if you see the dendrite and the cell soma या cell body, यहाँ पे roughly around 50 to 75 sodium channels होता है. अगर आप यहाँ पे जाओ, this is your axon hillock. So cell body पे approximately 50 to 75. ये मेरा axon hillock है और the initial segment. यहाँ पे there are approximately 500 sodium channels. ठीक है? ये मेरा myelin sheath है, surface of myelin. यहाँ पे roughly there are 25 sodium channels. This is my node of Ranvier. Node of Ranvier are the interruptions in between the myelin sheath, which helps in easy movement of an action potential. And the reason for this easy movement or fast movement of this action potential across the node of Ranvier is because presence of large number of sodium channels. और कितने होते हैं sodium channels यहाँ पे approximately 12,000 sodium channels. Now imagine if there are so many sodium channels, imagine the amount of sodium influx and the generation of action potential here. So node of Ranvier पे 12,000, surface of myelin sheath पे 25, and axon terminal पे they are reduced to 75 to 100 channels. So here it is 75 to 100 sodium channels. So the question is maximum number, and the maximum number is located in the nodes of Ranvier. ये हम लोगों ने डिस्कस नहीं किया था, हमने सिर्फ सोडियम चैनल्स डिस्कस किए थे, हमने नंबर्स डिस्कस नहीं किए थे. बट थोड़ा सा अगर आप और थोड़ा दिमाग लगाते तो आपको इजीली पता चल जाता कि नोड्स ऑफ Ranvier जहाँ पे इजी कंडक्शन हो रहा है of the action potential will show the maximum number of sodium channels. These are voltage gated sodium channels. So with this, yes, I've explained all the options, Bhushan. So with this, I'm really sorry with the scribbling part. The writing pad is not working properly, but I hope this particular concept of an action potential, which is the most important topic, is clear with you. And if you have any option, if you have any doubts, if you need any clarification, you can always message us, put it on the comment section. And once again, I take this opportunity to extend my special thanks to Dr. Sunil sir for giving this particular platform of Nextillo. It's a wonderful app with all the experienced faculty members, which will help you to understand these concepts, which are like the core topics, core concepts in your cracking of examination, your your clinical examinations that you're going to do, your practice that you're going to go ahead with in your life. So please subscribe to this particular app. You will have a very good experience and it will help you. And you can download the app and use helping hand coupon to avail the app for 3 months in rupees only 89. And you can ask questions, put up your queries, comment if there is any doubt, any clarification that you need. You're always welcome. So with this brief explanation on action potential, I bid goodbye and all the very best. And thank you for your excellent response. And I hope the questions and the answers are clear. Thank you so much.